Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into the thought of Cornelius Van Til.
Yeah, a really significant, sometimes controversial figure in 20th century theology,
Right.
Reformed theologian, apologist.
Absolutely. And our guide is this book, Cornelius Van Til, an analysis of his thought. It tries to look at his work, with understanding, but also with a critical eye.
Which is important with Van Til.
Right. So our mission, learner, is to get past the maybe simplistic takes on him. We want to grasp the core ideas, the nuances.
But understand why he's still relevant, why his thinking continues to influence Christian thought and apologetics today.
So this source text, it covers a lot. His life influences, the big concepts, his debates.
Oh, definitely the debates. And his legacy. It's kind of a shortcut for you, learner, to get a handle on a pretty complex thinker.
And the author makes this point right away. You can't just, debunk Van Til.
No, dismissive approaches just don't work. You really have to try and understand his fundamental vision, engage with it sympathetically.
The book contrasts this with someone like Berkhauer. Apparently, Berkhauer engaged deeply with others, but maybe didn't give Van Til that same level of sympathetic analysis.
Yeah, that's the suggestion. It's like you need that intellectual empathy first, even if you disagree later. It's about understanding what he was trying to achieve.
Getting under the skin of it, like you said.
Exactly. But understanding isn't the end goal. The aim, like the books, is critical evaluation too. Analyzing the strengths, maybe the weaknesses.
And that kind of sympathetic and critical analysis, it's been kind of rare with Van Til, hasn't it?
Surprisingly so, yeah.
So who is the man behind the ideas? The book gives us some glimpses. Prolific writer, preacher, teacher.
Took long walks with students at Westminster, apparently,
Hmm.
discussing these huge ideas. He even preached on Wall Street.
Wow. Quite the image. And his personality.
Well, he valued his followers, but seemed a bit wary of uncritical adulation, as the book puts it.
Interesting. He wanted them to think for themselves.
That's the fascinating part. He gave them his vocabulary, his system, but really pushed for independent thought. Even rewarded students who could rigorously, respectfully disagree.
So there's a tension there. System builder, but also educator.
Right. And his move to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church with Machen, that really shows his deep commitment to doctrinal orthodoxy. That shaped everything.
Okay, let's get into the core concepts. This idea of God as self-contained fullness. What's that about?
Okay, basically it's about God's absolute unity. Two aspects. Singularity, only one God, and simplicity. He isn't made of parts.
Right, not like ingredients added together.
Exactly. Van Til argued if you deny one, you undermine the other. Like, if God's justice could somehow exist apart from his being,
Mm.
well, then it's almost like another God.
I see. So it's not just abstract theology. It affects how we see God's relationship to everything. His attributes aren't separate. They are his being.
Precisely. It makes ideas like a just but uncaring God completely incoherent. It forces a holistic view.
Okay, got it. God's being is his goodness, his wisdom, all integrated. This self-sufficiency. It sets up his distinction between personalism and impersonalism, doesn't it?
It does. Van Til saw this as the fundamental dividing line. Christian worldview versus everything else.
Because
Because he argued only a personal God, one with intellect, will emotions can be the foundation for rationality, morality, order. Impersonal forces, abstract principles. They just can't ground reality.
makes sense.
Oh.
Where does value come from if the ultimate reality is just stuff or
Yeah,
a blind force?
Exactly. Where does right and wrong come from? A personal God provides that grounding. And the source notes, this is a powerful point apologetically, it speaks to our desire for connection, for meaning, for justice.
That resonates. Okay, moving to another big one, the Trinity.
Yeah, and Van Til was upfront about the difficulty here. Our language, our finite minds, we struggle to define it perfectly.
Phrases like one substance, three substances, they highlight the paradox.
Right. He pointed out even the creeds had to carefully choose words that weren't always perfectly distinct in their original languages. The human phrasing isn't the absolute point.
So what is the point?
It's about faithfully reflecting the scriptural truth. God is one, yet Father, Son, and Spirit are each fully distinctly God. It's about acknowledging the limits of our reason before the mystery.
So no neat, tidy, logical box for the Trinity. We accept the revealed truth even if it stretches us. This sounds related to the problem of the one and the many.
Absolutely connected. That old philosophical question, how do unity and diversity relate?
Hmm.
Van Til said this isn't just abstract. It affects reality. It affects how we know things.
And impersonal solutions don't work.
He argued they fail. They can't provide a coherent, unifying basis for truth. He used this analogy. A child in a dark forest holding its father's hand.
Okay.
The child sees the many trees, shadows, sounds, but the unifying one, the thing giving security and meaning, that's the personal father.
Ah, that's a great image. It makes it much clearer. Okay, next up, facts and laws. He says subjective laws applied to lawless facts leads to skepticism. Break that down.
Okay, Van Til's point is, without God providing a framework of meaning and order, facts just become random bits of data, and laws become just human inventions with no real authority.
So if we are the ultimate source imposing order on chaos,
Then there's no basis for objective knowledge, no lasting truth. We need a pre-existing, divinely set structure where both facts and laws make sense.
like the courtroom analogy and the source facts only matter within a legal framework.
Exactly. And for Van Til, the Christian worldview is the only framework that makes ultimate sense of both facts and laws.
So facts aren't neutral. They're always seen through a lens interpreted by a worldview.
Always. And he believed the Christian lens is the only one that ultimately works.
Which brings us to the problem of evil, theodicy. How did he handle that?
Mostly by appealing to God's inscrutable wisdom. God knows why, but he hasn't revealed the full answer to it.
So, submit our finite understanding to his infinite wisdom. Acknowledge the limits where Scripture is silent.
Pretty much. The book mentions he sometimes seemed to echo Calvin's view God as the ultimate cause of sin, humans the proximate. But the author of our source isn't totally convinced that Mecca fully resolves it.
It's a deep mystery.
It is. And Van Til, being reformed, aimed to uphold God's absolute sovereignty, even faced with evil, which naturally connects to election and reprobation.
Right. Given his view of sovereignty and human fallenness, where did that lead him on salvation?
For Van Til, his whole metaphysic, his view of reality, God's sovereignty, it demanded a Calvinistic view of salvation. God's grace has to be sovereign.
Why demanded?
Because if salvation ultimately depends on our unaided choice, he argued, it makes the eternal God dependent on finite humans. It undermines God's independence, his self-existence.
So other views like Arminianism were fundamentally flawed in how they saw the God-human relationship in salvation.
That was his perspective, yes. It didn't align with his understanding of God's absolute nature.
Okay. Now, this terminology seems really central. Human knowledge is analogous to God's. What does that mean?
Two key things. First, our knowledge is created knowledge. It's inherently different from God's infinite, exhaustive knowledge. We can't have a perfect copy.
Finite versus infinite.
Right. Second, our knowledge depends on and is subject to God's authority. We can think God's thoughts after him, but always under his revealed authority under Scripture.
And he used analogical for a specific kind of reasoning.
Yes, reasoning that consciously depends on God's revelation. That's opposed to univocal reasoning, assuming we think just like God, which risks autonomy or equivocal reasoning, suggesting there's no real connection at all.
So analogy is this middle ground. We can know truly, but not exhaustively or identically to God. It's created, dependent knowledge.
Exactly. It avoids presumption on one side and skepticism on the other.
And this was at the heart of the Clark controversy, wasn't it?
Precisely. It often gets boiled down to incomprehensibility. But the real issue with Gordon Clark was how God's knowledge and our knowledge relate. This analogical point.
What was the core disagreement?
It's centered on the content and mode of God's thoughts versus ours. Can we state divine truths exhaustively, identically to how God knows them?
And Van Til felt Clark leaned too much towards univocal, identical.
Yeah, he worried Clark's emphasis on logic implied too much similarity, potentially compromising the creator-creature distinction in knowledge, that our reason was being given too much autonomy.
So not just that God is incomprehensible, but the nature of the link between our finite grasp and his infinite understanding.
Exactly. And the book notes the outcome wasn't a clear win for Van Til's view in the OPC General Assembly. Clark remained in good standing. It highlights how complex these issues are.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift to revelation. How did Van Til see general and special revelation interacting?
He saw them as completely integrated, not separate categories. He argued even before the fall, humans needed supernatural, special revelation to properly interpret general revelation in nature.
So nature reveals God, but we need help interpreting it correctly.
Especially after the fall. Our fallen minds distort things. So special revelation, Scripture, becomes absolutely necessary to understand general revelation accurately.
And Scripture's authority wasn't limited.
Not at all.
Mhm.
Van Til saw its scope as unlimited, its authority as ultimate. It impacts how we interpret all facts, not just religious ones.
So the Bible provides the framework for understanding everything.
That was his view. He strongly affirmed those classic attributes: sufficiency, clarity, perspicuity, necessity, and authority. And they're all linked. Scripture is the light by which everything else must be seen.
Okay. Now, a priori and presuppositions, these feel foundational to his whole system.
They absolutely are. For Van Til, presuppositions aren't just things you happen to believe first. They're the fundamental commitments that shape all your knowledge.
The governing beliefs.
Right. And God is the ultimate presupposition, the bedrock for all true knowledge. The self, our consciousness, is the proximate one, our immediate starting point.
So we start with self-awareness, but the validity of that and everything else rests on God.
Yes. Like
Yeah.
the foundation of a house.
Mm.
You enter the door, experience, but the whole thing stands or falls on the foundation, God.
Our deepest beliefs about God shape everything, acknowledged or not. It's
Yeah.
not about consciously thinking God before every thought, but he's the ultimate source.
Exactly.
The book mentions his analogy between the mind's faculties, intellect, will, emotions, and the Trinity. That's interesting.
Yes, he saw an analogical link there.
Yeah.
Distinct yet unified aspects of human personality mirroring the persons of the Trinity. He also suggested an economic primacy for the intellect, meaning the intellect kind of leads, providing the will with reasons for action. Though, as the source points out, some critique this for potentially leading to an over-intellectualized faith in some circles.
Right, maybe downplaying will and emotion. A good reminder that even useful analogies have limits. Okay, logic and consistency. He was clearly a systematic thinker.
Very much so. He stressed how doctrines connect logically, how one flows from another. Like God's self-sufficiency requires self-attesting revelation, or the Trinity allows for analogical knowledge.
He even used Kant's limiting concepts.
He did, but adapted them. For Van Til, they showed the limits of our finite understanding before the infinite, curbing sensory experiences claims.
What about contradictions?
He spoke of apparent contradictions, suggesting that within revelation some paradoxes might exist because human logic hits its limits with transcendent truths. But crucially, he stressed interpreting doctrines in light of all of Scripture, which can restrain pure logical deduction sometimes.
So logic is a tool, but it operates within revelation, not above it.
Exactly. Its boundaries are set by Scripture's overall message.
Which brings us to using evidence and reason in apologetics. He didn't reject them outright.
No, absolutely not. But he insisted they must be used in a Christian way, not assuming human autonomy. His big critique was against just presenting facts without challenging the unbeliever's underlying philosophy.
Because facts aren't neutral.
Never neutral for Van Til, always interpreted. So presenting facts without dealing with the interpretive framework is often pointless. The unbeliever just fits them into their own non-Christian system.
So challenge the foundation first. Don't just throw bricks of evidence at a different building, so to speak.
That's a good way to put it. It's about the worldview beneath the interpretation of evidence.
This leads right into the antithesis and common grace. Big concepts for Van Til.
Huge. The antithesis is that fundamental opposition between Christian and non-Christian worldviews. At its most extreme, it sounds like no common ground is possible.
But did he live that rigidly?
The book suggests, maybe not entirely in practice, he found points of agreement. It distinguishes between situational and normative unbelief. Situationally, unbelievers live in God's world, maybe even presuppose him unconsciously.
But normatively?
Normatively, their core worldview is opposed to Scripture. And Van Til strongly affirmed common grace, too.
God's goodness even to unbelievers, restraining evil, allowing for art, science, etc.
Exactly. Blessings, abilities, restraints, given even to those who don't believe. The source says Van Til saw common grace as foundational, part of the created order itself, before the final separation.
So there's a deep divide, antithesis, but also a shared reality and God's goodness operating common grace. It allows for complexity.
It does. It explains how unbelievers can know true things or do good things, even while their ultimate foundation is wrong.
Okay. And the book briefly mentions his critiques of, well, almost everyone else.
Yeah, quite a few. Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Kant, Barth, Dewey, Weird, Schaeffer, Butler, Carnell, rationalists, irrationalists.
What's the common thread in his critiques?
It always comes back to the starting point. His concern was that these other systems, in various ways, started with human autonomy or assumed some neutral ground for thinking, rather than beginning with God's self-revelation.
Always back to presuppositions. And that really sums up his legacy and method, doesn't it? His impossibility of the contrary argument.
Right, trying to show that only the Christian worldview provides a coherent foundation for reality, knowledge, ethics, that alternatives ultimately self-destruct.
And the circularity aspect.
The book acknowledges it. If your ultimate standard is being debated, you inevitably argue from that standard to defend it. Van Til and his followers would argue it's not a vicious circle, but a necessary one when dealing with ultimate commitments.
So start with the self-attesting Christ of Scripture.
That's the core. And
Right.
preach Christ-centered, God-centered messages that recognize Scripture as God's living word.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We've taken a deep dive into Cornelius Van Til complex, influential, emphasizing God's sovereignty and the need to presuppose his revelation, challenging neutral starting points, autonomous reason.
Yeah, understanding his ideas on analogy, the antithesis, common grace, his critiques, it really illuminates a lot of current debates in theology and apologetics.
So the final thought for you, the learner. Given Van Til's stress on presuppositions, how does that change how you think about knowledge, about engaging with different worldviews?
What are the real-world implications if all thought ultimately rests on either Christian or non-Christian foundations? It pushes you to examine your own foundations, doesn't it? The bedrock assumptions shaping how you see absolutely everything.